The operation manual was buried in my desk and I never looked at it. If I had, I might have had some idea of the big changes that were in store. None of us knew the littlest bit about what a robot can or cannot do. Ned was working nicely as a combination janitor file clerk and should have stayed that way. He would have, too, if the chief hadn't been so lazy. That's what started it all. It was around 9 at night and the chief was just going home when the call came in. He took it, listened for a moment, then hung up. "Greenback's liquor store. He got held up again. Says to come at once." "That's a change. Usually we don't hear about it until a month later. What's he paying protection money for if China Joe ain't protecting? What's the rush now?" The chief chewed his loose lip for a while, finally and painfully reached a decision. "You better go around and see what the trouble is." "Sure," I said, reaching for my cap, "but no one else is around. You'll have to watch the desk until I get back." "That's no good," he moaned. "I'm dying from hunger, and sitting here isn't going to help me any." "I will go take the report," Ned said, stepping forward and snapping his usual well-greased salute. At first the chief wasn't buying. You would think the water cooler came to life and offered to take over his job. "How could you take a report?" he growled, putting the wise guy water cooler in its place. But he had phrased his little insult as a question, so he had only himself to blame. In exactly 3 minutes, Ned gave the chief a summary of the routine necessary for a police officer to make a report on an armed robbery or other reported theft. From the glazed look in Chief's protruding eyes, I could tell Ned had quickly passed the boundaries of the chief's meager knowledge. "Enough!" the harried man finally gasped. "If you know so much, why don't you make a report?" Which to me sounded like another version of, "If you're so damn smart, why ain't you rich?" which we used to snarl at the brainy kids in grammar school. Ned took such things literally, though, and turned towards the door. "Do you mean you wish me to make a report on this robbery?" "Yes," the chief said, just to get rid of him, and we watched his blue shape vanish through the door. "He must be brighter than he looks," I said. "He never stopped to ask where Greenback's store is." The chief nodded, and the phone rang again. His hand was still resting on it, so he picked it up by reflex. He listened for a second, and you would have thought someone was pumping blood out of his heel from the way his face turned white. "The holdup's still on," he finally gasped. "Greenback's delivery boy is on the line, calling back to see where we are. Says he's under a table in the back room." I never heard the rest of it because I was out the door and into the car. There were 100 things that could have happened if Ned got there before me. Guns could go off, people hurt, lots of things. And the police would be to blame for it all, sending a tin robot to do a cop's job. Maybe the chief had ordered Ned there, but clearly, as if the words were painted on the windshield of the car, I knew I would be dragged into it. It never gets very warm on Mars, but I was sweating. Nineport has 14 traffic regulations, and I broke all of them before I had gone a block. Fast as I was, Ned was faster. As I turned the corner, I saw him open the door of Greenback's store and walk in. I screamed brakes in behind him and arrived just in time to have a gallery seat. A shooting gallery at that. There were 2 hold-up punks, one behind the counter making like a clerk, and the other lounging off to one side. Their guns were out of sight, but blue-coated Ned bursting through the door was too much for their keyed-up nerves. Up came both guns like they were on strings, and Ned stopped dead. I grabbed for my own gun and waited for pieces of busted robot to come flying through the window. Ned's reflexes were great, which I suppose is what you should expect of a robot. "Drop your guns, you are under arrest." He must have had on full power or something. His voice blasted so loud my ears hurt. The result was just what you might expect. Both torpedoes let go at once, and the air was filled with flying slugs. The show windows went out with a crash, and I went down on my stomach. From the amount of noise, I knew they both had recoilless 50s. You can't stop one of those slugs. They go right through you and anything else that happens to be in the way. Except they didn't seem to be bothering Ned. The only notice he seemed to take was to cover his eyes. A little shield with a thin slit popped down over his eye lenses. Then he moved in on the first thug. I knew he was fast, but not that fast. A couple of slugs jarred him as he came across the room, but before the punk could change his aim, Ned had the gun in his hand. That was the end of that. He put on one of the sweetest hammerlocks I've ever seen and neatly grabbed the gun when it dropped from the limp fingers. With the same motion that slipped the gun into a pouch, he whipped out a pair of handcuffs and snapped them on the punk's wrists. Hold-upnik number 2 was heading for the door by then, and I was waiting to give him a warm reception. There was never any need. He hadn't gone halfway before Ned slid in front of him. There was a thud when they hit that didn't even shake Ned, but gave the other a glazed look. He never even knew it when Ned slipped the cuffs on him and dropped him down next to his partner. I went in, took their guns from Ned, and made the arrest official. That was all Greenback saw when he crawled out from behind the counter, and it was all I wanted him to see. The place was a foot deep in broken glass and smelled like the inside of a Jack Daniels bottle. Greenback began to howl like a wolf over his lost stock. He didn't seem to know any more about the phone call than I did, so I grabbed a hold of a pimply-looking kid who staggered out of the storeroom. He was the one who had made the calls. It turned out to be a matter of sheer stupidity. He had worked for Greenback only a few days and didn't have enough brains to realize that all holdups should be reported to the protection boys instead of the police. I told Greenback to wise up his boy, as look at the trouble that got caused, then pushed the two ex-holdup men out to the car. Ned climbed in back with them, and they clung together like two waifs in a storm. The robot's only response was to pull a first aid kit from his hip and fix up a ricochet hole in one of the thugs that no one had noticed in the excitement. The chief was still sitting there with that bloodless look when we marched in. I didn't believe it could be done, but he went 2 shades whiter. "You made the pinch?" he whispered. Before I could straighten him out, a second and more awful idea hit him. He grabbed a handful of shirt on the first torpedo and poked his face down. "You with China Joe?" he snarled. The punk made the error of trying to be cute, so the chief let him have one on the head with the open hand that set his eyes rolling like marbles. When the question got asked again, he found the right answer. "I never heard from no China Joe. We just hit town today and—" Freelance. By God. The chief sighed and collapsed into his chair. "Lock him up and quickly tell me what in hell happened." I slammed the gate on them and pointed a none too steady finger at Ned. "There's the hero," I said. "Took them on single-handed, rassled them for a fall, and made the capture. He's a one-robot tornado, a power for good in this otherwise evil community. And he's bulletproof, too." I ran a finger over Ned's broad chest. The paint was chipped by the slugs, but the metal was hardly scratched. "This is going to cause me big trouble, the chief wailed. I knew he meant with the protection boys. They did not like punks getting arrested and guns going off without their okay. But Ned thought the chief had other worries and rushed in to put them right. "There will be no trouble. At no time did I violate any of the robotic restriction laws. They are part of my control circuits and therefore fully automatic. The men who drew their guns violated both robotic and human laws when they threatened violence. I did not injure the men, merely restrained them." It was all over the chief's head, but I like to think I could follow it. And I had been wondering how a robot, a machine, could be involved in something like law application and violence. Ned had the answer to that one, too. "Robots have been assuming these functions for years. Don't recording radar meters pass judgment on human violation of automobile regulations? A robot alcohol detector is better qualified to assess the sobriety of a prisoner than the arresting officer. At one time, robots were even allowed to make their own decisions about killing. Before the robotic restriction laws, automatic gun pointers were in general use. Their final development was a self-contained battery of large anti-aircraft guns. Automatic scan radar detected all aircraft in the vicinity. Those that could not return the correct identifying signal had their courses tracked and computed. Automatic fuse cutters and loaders readied the computer-aimed guns, which were fired by the robot mechanism." There was little I could argue about with Ned, except maybe his college professor vocabulary, so I switched the attack. "But a robot can't take the place of a cop. It's a complex human job." "Of course it is, but taking a human policeman's place is not the function of a police robot. Primarily, I combine the functions of numerous pieces of police equipment, integrating their operations and making them instantly available. In addition, I can aid in the mechanical process of law enforcement. If you arrest a man, you handcuff him. But if you order me to do it, I have made no moral decision. I am just a machine for attaching handcuffs at that point." My raised hand cut off the flow of robotic argument. Ned was hipped to his ears with facts and figures, and I had a good idea who would come off second best in any continued discussion. No laws had been broken when Ned made the pinch, that was for sure. But there are other laws than those that appear on the books. "China Joe is not going to like this. Not at all," the chief said, speaking my own thoughts. "The law of tooth and claw. That's one that wasn't in the law books. And that was what ran Nineport. The place was just big enough to have a good population of gambling joints, bawdy houses, and drunk rollers. They were all run by China Joe, as was the police department. We were all in his pocket, and you might say he was the one who paid our wages. This is not the kind of